Have you ever seen someone surrounded by joy, yet completely invisible? What would you do if those eyes turned to you, silently asking for help? Have you ever walked through a place so alive with sound, so full of color and movement, and yet felt your eyes drawn not to the people laughing or the children running, but to the one creature sitting utterly still, quiet, unnoticed, as though the whole world had decided to turn its back? On a golden afternoon, when the sun spilled warmth across the grass of a busy neighborhood park, when the air was thick with the hum of conversations, the rustle of leaves, and the cheerful cries of children on swings, there was one small figure that did not belong, one soul whose stillness spoke louder than the noise around him. And that was a dog, scruffy and thin, lying under the crooked shade of a tree that leaned just slightly toward the playground. His fur, once perhaps a proud coat of gold or tan, was dulled by dust, tangled with burrs, and clumped in places where dirt had matted it down. His ribs pressed faintly against his sides, showing the long stretch of days without proper meals, and his paws, worn, cracked, and tired, rested heavily on the ground as though each step had carried him through more than a share of miles. He didn't beg, he didn't bark, he didn't whine. He only watched, his eyes following the families who passed by, his tail giving the smallest hopeful twitch whenever a glance lingered on him, only to fall still again when the moment passed, and the people carried on, too busy or too blind to see what he was offering with that silent gaze. It is strange, isn't it, how a dog can speak with his eyes. You don't need words to understand him. You don't need explanations. You only need to look into that soft brown sadness that seems to carry a lifetime of waiting. And so there he was, a gentle presence in a sea of energy, invisible to everyone except perhaps the children who tugged on their parents' sleeves, whispering, "Look, a dog," before being hurried along with distracted promises of "maybe later," and "don't touch, he might be dirty." And dirty he was, yes, but beneath the grime, beneath the thin frame and the tired limbs, there was the unmistakable shape of hope, fragile but stubborn, like a candle refusing to go out no matter how the wind tries. And then came Lily. She wasn't anyone remarkable to look at, not in the way a movie character might sweep into a scene with a flourish, but in her ordinariness there was something grounding, something kind, something real. She was in her mid-20s, her shoulder-length brown hair, pulled loosely back so strands brushed against her cheeks in the warm breeze, her jeans faded at the knees, her plain white t-shirt soft from wear, her sneakers carrying the dust of long walks. Over one shoulder hung a canvas tote bag, corners stretched by a book and a water bottle and a few odds and ends from her day. She had come to the park, like many others, to enjoy the sunshine, maybe to find a quiet patch of grass where she could read, maybe to escape the hum of her busy thoughts. But unlike the others, her steps slowed as she passed the old tree, her gaze caught by that unmoving figure beneath its shade. She did not brush him aside, did not quicken her pace with averted eyes. Instead, she stopped. Have you ever felt that strange tug, that moment when something inside you whispers that you cannot keep walking, that you have stumbled upon something fragile, and if you leave it now, it might never find its way back? That is what Lily felt as she stood there, tote bag slipping slightly down her arm, watching the dog's eyes lift to meet hers. There was no bark, no sound, no movement beyond the faintest flick of his tail. But in that flicker, there was a question so raw, so painfully simple. "Will you see me?" Lily set her bag down on the grass, kneeling a few feet away, careful not to rush, careful not to break the delicate thread that had somehow been stretched between them. She leaned forward slightly, her hand resting gently on her knee, fingers loose, palm open, not reaching, not demanding, just offering space. Her eyes softened, her mouth curved in the smallest of smiles, the kind that says, "It's okay, I won't hurt you." The dog lifted his head just enough to notice, his ears twitching back and forth, his nose sniffing the air as though testing whether the scent of this young woman carried danger or safety. For a long moment, nothing happened, only the weight of the world pressing down in silence, only the laughter of children spilling through the background like a song that belonged to someone else's life. And then, slowly, carefully, the dog's tail moved again, a gentle thump against the dry earth, uncertain but undeniable. Isn't it remarkable how something so small, a wag of a tail, can feel like the opening of a door. Lily's breath caught, her heart pulling her forward though her body stayed steady, patient. She did not lunge, did not call, did not try to close the space too quickly. She only let him see her, let him decide whether she was different from all the others who had passed him by. Her presence was quiet but persistent, a warmth in the air that the dog seemed to feel as he lowered his head again but did not close his eyes, as though afraid that if he blinked, she might disappear. Minutes passed, the world carrying on without them, until it seemed that the playground, the families, the park itself had blurred into nothing but the space beneath that tree, the woman with her patient hand, and the dog who wanted so badly to believe. And perhaps you are wondering, did he move closer? Did he crawl forward into her arms? Did this become the instant of rescue? No, not yet. Because trust is not a gift given lightly by those who have been forgotten too many times. It is something that blooms slowly, painfully, beautifully, like a flower pushing its way through a crack in the pavement. What mattered in that moment was not that he leapt into her embrace, but that he stayed, that he watched, that he let her presence seep into the edges of his guarded world. And Lily, kneeling there with the sunlight warming her shoulders, understood something that could not be spoken, only felt. This was not going to be simple, this was not going to be quick, but it was worth every minute, every ounce of patience, because some souls are too precious to leave behind. So she remained there, offering quiet company, until the shadows stretched longer and the laughter of children began to fade with the sinking sun, and still the dog stayed beneath his tree, still watching, still waiting, his eyes now tethered not to the crowd but to the young woman who had stopped when no one else would. And that is where the story begins, with a silent promise hanging in the air, with a choice yet to be made, because the question still lingered heavy between them, unanswered. Would Lily be the one to reach him, to draw him out of his lonely world, to show him that kindness could still exist? Or would the moment slip away like all the others, leaving him to watch another day pass from the shade of that same tree? Do you know that moment when a decision hangs in the air so heavily it feels as if the world itself is holding its breath, waiting to see whether a step will be taken or whether silence will win? And in that fragile space between fear and courage, everything can change. That was the moment when Lily, kneeling under the wide branches of the tree, knew she could not simply stand up and walk away, because to do so would be to join the countless others who had seen and passed, who had noticed and ignored, who had glanced and then forgotten, and she could not, she would not, allow herself to become another shadow in this dog's memory of people who turned away. Her fingers searched inside her canvas tote until they brushed against the crinkling of a packet of crackers, an ordinary snack she had packed without thought. But now, in her hand, they became something else entirely, not just food but an offering, a fragile bridge stretched across the space between one world of abandonment and another of possibility. She broke one piece into smaller fragments, her hand trembling slightly not from fear of the dog but from the weight of what this moment meant, and she set them down slowly on the grass, pushing them just close enough that the warm, dusty nose of the animal might dare to reach. The dog did not move at first, his head resting low against his paws, his eyes flicking between the food and Lily's face as though weighing 1,000 memories of disappointment against the glimmer of something different, something softer, something true. His body was still except for the twitch of his ears and the almost imperceptible rise and fall of his chest. But in those eyes, those brown, patient, wounded eyes, there was a calculation taking place, the kind of calculation only a creature who has been left too many times can perform, the question of whether it is safer to stay still and hungry or risk stepping toward the unknown. And then, slowly, with a movement so hesitant it was almost painful to watch, he shifted his weight forward, his front paw dragging just slightly across the dirt, his head lifting, his body trembling with uncertainty, but his nose pressing toward the crumbs. Lily held her breath, her body frozen, her hand open and low to the ground as though she was offering the earth itself. And when the dog's tongue brushed the first crumb into his mouth, it was as though a spark had lit in the air between them. Do you know how it feels when hope becomes visible, when you can see it in real time like a fragile thread weaving itself into something stronger? That was the feeling that coursed through Lily as the dog ate another crumb, and another, until finally he lifted his head and looked directly at her. And in that look there was no bark, no wag, no leap of joy, only the quiet acknowledgement that she was different from the ones before, that perhaps she was worth one more chance. She did not move quickly. She did not reach to grab. She did not rush to cage or leash. She only spoke softly, words that carried no meaning in language but were soaked in tone, words like, "It's okay, boy, you're safe," words spoken not to command but to soothe, and though the dog did not understand syllables, he understood intention, and his body, though still tense, did not retreat. The sun was lower now, painting the park in warm gold, shadows stretching long across the grass, and Lily knew the day was slipping away, yet something inside her refused to leave this connection unfinished. She rose slowly, not to go but to fetch her car, her steps careful, her voice still flowing behind her like a ribbon of reassurance. The dog did not run, did not vanish back into the invisible places strays so often disappear. He stayed, watching, waiting, and that was enough to make Lily's heart hammer with urgency, because he had stayed for her. Minutes later she returned with her small car parked at the edge of the path, the door open wide, the blanket from her back seat spread across the floor as if to say, "This space belongs to you now, if you want it." She knelt once more, this time with a half sandwich from her bag. It scent far stronger than crackers, and she placed it close, retreating her hand to give him room, her eyes steady on his every move. The dog sniffed, stepped forward on shaking legs, ears flattened, tail low but moving, and at last, after a breathless pause, he climbed in, not leaping, not confident, but cautiously, one paw, then another, until his whole body rested on the blanket. Lily exhaled a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her throat tightening with relief, her chest swelling with something that was more than joy, more than triumph, something closer to awe, the awe of witnessing a living creature choose trust after everything it had suffered. She slid into the driver's seat, closing the door gently, her voice soft and constant as she started the engine, promising him that this was not a trick, not a trap, not a fleeting moment of kindness that would dissolve by morning, but the beginning of something new. The drive was slow, quiet except for the hum of the wheels on the pavement and the occasional sigh from the back seat, a sound that was neither fear nor comfort, but something in between, the sound of a creature in transition. Lily glanced in the rearview mirror, catching glimpses of his eyes, wide and alert but no longer panicked, and she whispered words she hoped would reach him, even if he could not understand. "You're safe now, I promise." When they reached her small home, she parked and turned, meeting his gaze once more, and for a moment they both sat there in silence, as though acknowledging that stepping out of the car would mean stepping into a new life, and perhaps that was the heaviest step of all. She opened the door, the evening air rushing in, and waited, patient as ever, watching him weigh the safety of the blanket against the mystery of what lay ahead. And here is where we must pause, because though he had stepped in her car, though he had allowed himself to be carried away from the tree that had been his silent prison, the question remained, would he take that next step into her home, into the unknown warmth of four walls and gentle hands, or would fear seize him again, dragging him backward into a world of hesitation and shadows? The night air was cooling quickly, crickets beginning their steady song, the porch light glowing faintly, and Lily stood beside the open door, her hand resting on the frame, her body still, her heart pleading quietly, "Please trust me enough to follow." And just then, as his paws shifted on the blanket and his eyes darted toward the doorway, something happened, something so small yet so decisive, that would determine whether this story became one of rescue fulfilled or of trust lost forever. There are moments in life when time seems to stretch, when a single heartbeat feels as though it carries the weight of an entire story, when silence hums with a question so profound that the answer, whichever way it leans, will alter everything that follows. And that was the moment when Lily stood by her car door with the porch lights spilling across the driveway, her breath held tight, her heart whispering promises she could not yet prove, waiting to see whether the dog would step forward into the unknown or retreat back into the shell of fear he had built to survive. The dog's paws shifted against the blanket, his nose twitching at the scents that drifted from the open doorway of Lily's little home. Faint traces of wood and lavender from the candle, she had left burning earlier, the warmth of a place that had been lived in, a place that carried the subtle imprint of safety. He hesitated, ears flicking, body trembling, his eyes darting to the night sky, as if to ask whether he belonged more to the wild dark than to this glowing threshold. And then, with a slowness so careful it almost broke Lily's heart, he placed one paw down on the cool concrete, then another, until at last he stood outside the car, head low, tail cautious, but undeniably closer to her than he had ever been before. Do you know that feeling when relief washes over you so strongly, it is almost indistinguishable from tears, when joy is not loud or explosive but soft and aching, as though your heart itself is learning how to breathe again? That was the feeling that rose in Lily's chest as she knelt beside him, whispering quietly, "Good boy, you're so brave," and reached out her hand, not to pull or push, but simply to let him know she was there, her presence steady as a lighthouse guiding him toward shore he had never dared imagine existed. Inside, the house felt different with him there, as though the walls themselves leaned in curiously to welcome this new presence, as though the silence had been waiting all along for the sound of his hesitant steps across the floor. He sniffed every corner, pacing slowly, his tail twitching between uncertainty and curiosity, his eyes flicking to Lily, as though asking permission for each new discovery. She let him explore, let him learn the contours of the space that was now as much his as hers. And when at last he curled on the rug near her couch, resting his head on his paws, releasing a long, weary sigh that seemed to spill out years of waiting, she felt tears sting her eyes, because that sigh was not just a sound, it was trust, it was surrender, it was the fragile, extraordinary act of a soul deciding it was safe enough to rest. The days that followed were not without struggle, for healing is never a straight path, and there were moments when a sudden noise would send him cowering, when the clatter of a dropped dish or the rumble of a passing truck would awaken the old ghosts of fear, but Lily met each of those moments with patience, kneeling beside him, whispering reassurance, showing him with every touch, every word, every calm breath that he was no longer alone. Slowly, the tremors faded, the flinches softened, and the shadows that once clung to him began to loosen their grip, replaced by a growing light that seemed to shine brighter with each wag of his tail, with each eager glance when she called his name, with each step he took closer to joy. There came a day, not long after his first night in her home, when Lily opened her back door to the yard, the grass glistening in morning dew, and he paused on the threshold just as he had paused at her car, his paws once again caught between hesitation and hope. But this time, instead of trembling, he bounded forward, racing across the yard with an energy that seemed to shake the very earth beneath him, his ears flopping, his tongue lolling, his tail a banner of freedom that waved with every stride. And Lily stood at the door laughing, her hands pressed against her chest, because she had never seen anything more beautiful than that moment of release. And isn't that what rescue truly is? Not just the act of saving, but the privilege of watching transformation unfold, of witnessing a spirit that had been bent and bruised stand tall once more, of seeing joy bloom in a place where sorrow had once lived. That was what Lily saw every day as the dog, her dog now, though she still marveled at the word, learned to trust, to play, to love, and to be loved. At night he would curl beside her on the couch, resting his head in her lap, his breathing deep and even, and she would stroke his fur absent-mindedly while reading, her fingers moving over the soft coat that had once been matted with dirt, but now gleamed with health. Sometimes he would look up at her with those same brown eyes that had first caught her beneath the tree, but they no longer carried the weight of invisibility. Instead, they shone with gratitude, with quiet devotion, with the unspoken but undeniable truth that he had found his person at last. The vet confirmed what Lily already knew in her heart, that he was healthy enough to recover fully, that with food, care, and time he would thrive. She filled out the paperwork, signed her name, and when the moment came to write his name on the line beside hers, she paused, smiling softly, because though he had been nameless when she found him, though the world had passed him by as though he did not exist, he was nameless no longer. She named him Chance because that was what he had been given and what he had taken, a second chance at life, at love, at belonging. From that day forward, Chance was not astray, not invisible, not forgotten. He was family. And yet, even as Lily basked in the joy of her new companion, even as she laughed at his clumsy leaps after butterflies or felt her heart swell when he pressed his paw gently onto her knee, as if to say thank you, she could not help but think of the countless others still waiting under trees, still lying by park benches, still curling into themselves on street corners, invisible to a world that moves too quickly to notice. She thought of them not with despair but with determination, for she knew that if one moment of pausing, one act of noticing, one choice to stop and extend a hand could transform Chance's life, then perhaps others could too, and perhaps if enough people chose to see, there would be fewer forgotten souls left to wait. And so, as the sun dipped low on another golden evening, as Chance bounded joyfully across the yard and Lily sat watching with a smile that came from a place deeper than words, the narrator's voice, gentle, reflective, almost like a friend leaning close to share a truth, asks you now, isn't it astonishing how one act of kindness can ripple outward, turning loneliness into laughter, turning fear into trust, turning a forgotten stray into a beloved companion? And perhaps the real question, the one that lingers long after the story ends, is not about Chance or even about Lily, but about you, about all of us. If another soul waits beneath a tree tomorrow, thin and quiet and invisible, will you keep walking, or will you stop, as Lily did, and offer them their chance? Because in the end, rescue stories do not belong only to those we watch from afar. They belong to every heart brave enough to see, to pause, and to care.